All right. Good morning, Nick. Good to see you. This is Nic and Matt. We're back. And today we are talking about reading comprehension. And there's a wide variety of things we could talk about. We will talk about the subject a number of times during these talks, but we thought this morning we would just kind of address certain myths and misconceptions. And we are right in Nick's sweet spot. This is something you've studied extensively and are very passionate about. So I'm going to try to speak as little as possible and yield the floor as much as possible to you. So
first, I just want to say apologies to people listening, because you ask somebody about their dissertation research and you're going to regret it. But I'll try not to do that. But thanks, Matt, for giving me the opportunity. Good morning, everybody. So I think one of the things is why reading comprehension, and there's a word I prefer a little bit more, which is learning from text, is on my mind. I recently taught a class or seminar here at Princeton for highly accomplished students, challenged by the reading demands. And I think that lens interrupts a lot of thinking that people have about reading. How is it possible that these Princeton students, some of whom are upper, juniors and seniors, quote, need a reading course in college? Let me just start by saying that the longest running course at Harvard was the Harvard reading course. It was taught for 80 years.
80?
80.
Wow.
Yes. So this should tell us something. I think, again, want to interrupt some thinking, assumptions, some misconceptions about reading, learning from text. And the first one is that reading is kind of one thing. You learn it once, and then you just apply it to different texts. This is not so. We've understood that in a variety of theoretical lenses, from the cognitive perspective, from the sociocultural lens, but it's also been documented in history. One of my favorite quotes is Goethe, the famous German polymath, said, "I spent a lifetime learning to read." So what does that mean? That means he's encountering new texts, new purposes, new contexts, new uses of what he's learning from reading. And some people might say, well, that's not reading, that's something else that you're on top of reading. That's critical thinking. And I think from my point of view, all those uses and contexts fundamentally inform the process and practices of reading. Reading is not a one last thing. Reading is not a unitary thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, is that why you call learning from the text? It gives it a little bit more flexibility in a way in terms of what you're doing with the text.
That's right.
Okay.
We always read with a purpose. We always read in a context. We're always reading a particular text. Reading as a abstraction has its uses, but if you think about your experience and one as a reader, it's always particular. You're not just reading. You're reading something for a purpose in a context with prior knowledge, and the text has content and features, and all those things matter to your ability to engage with it and then do with it what you want. And I think our reflection on that is useful. We've probably all encountered a text, we're like, wow, this doesn't make any sense to me at first, and then it did. Or you're like, well, but it makes sense to them. Or I have a text that does make sense to me. Why can't they figure this out? And so that is something we can think of as comprehension, but what are the processes and moves and practices that lead to that? And so that's what I think a lot about, is trying to break that down. A lot of those are hard to teach because they're taking place internally. You're not observable. And they vary by community and context and culture, which is itself also invisible.
Now, when you just to roll back a little bit, you talked about how we tend to think of reading as one thing or one way. Is that kind of like the novel approach? And when I mean novel, I mean like you're going to sit down and read a story. You start on page 1 and just go to the end. And I know when I was teaching at Princeton, I was trying to get students to not think that way.
Yeah, that's
only. I mean, just tell me more what you meant by that.
Yeah, what I mean by ways of reading.
Or you said we tend to think of reading as one thing. I guess you've already said that in terms of.
But yeah, I can illustrate that. Let me start and I do. So think about reading for devotional purposes, religious purposes.
Hmm.
I think we would all say that the experience of that is quite different than reading the newspaper or reading a chapter in my STEM book for an exam. The experience of it, the way I process it, different. How I read, and so I'm not going to get into at the moment the internal mental processes and motivational processes and even social processes, but I'm not going to get into those for the moment. But think about reading a novel to be escaped, to be immersed, to lose yourself in that is quite different than reading for the purposes of then doing a critical analysis of that to write an essay or talk about it in class. I think if we introspect and look into our internal processes, it feels different. And and the research tells us, it's hard for the individual to know this, but through various experimental research paradigms, to unpack those internal processes, they're importantly different. Or if they're not, then you're not reading the way you're expected to in these different contexts, right? Try reading a religious text and then bring that to temple, church, synagogue in a way that's more like academic versus for purposes of prayer devotion. Things will happen. Or also, if you read a scholarly book by some scholar and you treat it as revelation in the academic context, this is not the proper way to read. This is not the socially appropriate contextual way to read. And you're going to experience that because what counts as reading is determined socially by the context.
Yeah, well, that's good to know because my next question was, so what? Like if you're reading it in an inappropriate way contextually, what's the fallout from that?
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of a couple of vague examples. But let me use one of the ones that really just came home to me as a teacher. So when I was at Berkeley in graduate school, I was teaching in a course, and the course was teaching students how to adjust academically to the university, in particular, how to read and learn. And the class was called Learning from Text, actually. And I would have all the students in my class were concurrently enrolled in another course, sociology, anthropology, psychology. In this case, it was called ethnic studies. So an introduction to this ethnic studies. And in this class, it was, I don't know, 8th or 10th week or something. So we've been in a while. The professor assigned, so this was a historical analysis of migration and immigration into the United States and how its effects on society and then society's effects on immigration. And migration. So this assignment of a reading was the book Jazz by Toni Morrison. So a famous book of fiction, and it's kind of stream of consciousness fiction if you know her kind of writing. So I sat down to read it because it was my job to do that in the class, and I understood that the reason that was assigned is because it was a story set in early 20th century Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance, and it was a description of that and describing experiences, and we've seen the relations and these people in relation to this context and in relation to their recent migration from the South, Black people primarily from the South. So the professor was a historian. We were supposed to read it as a historical lens to learn what was going on in the time, but from a different vantage point. So you might call it historical fiction or something like that, but not in a very particular, like what these events happened, but what was it like? What did it feel like? And the class was about the experiences of migration. Well, the students came to class, so I just took that for granted. Of course, that's what I'm supposed to do. The students came and they give me these, we're talking about, and they're doing these lovely analyses of figurative language and symbolism, and notice this. And I was like, well, what about the history? And they're like, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, wait, why was this assigned? So this is an example. They did fantastic readings, better than I could as literary readings. I would call them literary readings, but they were not context specific. They didn't understand the function of the text in the course design, which followed from the fact that the professor was a historian, not a literary critic or literary scholar, and that wasn't the purpose of the course. And so that context, they could do a good reading, but from another contextual point of view. And this really came home to me because they were such good readings. It wasn't that they couldn't read well. right? They did fantastic readings. They just didn't read the way that they were expected to read.
That's really interesting. That made me think. I can't remember. There was a series of mystery novels set in Kenya. It was a woman detective.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think the guy.
Botswana. I think it was Botswana.
Botswana, maybe, but the
Lady
author
detective or something.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
and she was Scottish. The author is a male. I think he was Scottish, but having spent time in Kenya, the rhythms of the way they talked and just the way he wrote it was like, oh my gosh, it just took me right back. So I could probably appreciate the writing more than others just from that experience. So that's when you were talking, that just made me think of that.
Well, I think that points to, so let's use that as a starting point for another topic, another kind of myths and misconception about reading. So most people haven't thought too much about it, but you see, if you ask people or you look at some of the ways that people talk about how they read in school, they'll use a verb like absorb. Like, okay, what are you trying to, I'm trying to absorb the information from the text. So like a sponge, my colleagues and I call it the sponge metaphor, to absorb the information. This assumes a certain model of how reading, comprehension, and learning and retention takes place. That is inaccurate. Human beings are not sponges, nor are we computers. Human minds are not like computers. We do not process in the same way. The idea that we do is completely mistaken. Humans make meaning by constructing an interpretation in interaction with the text. So the text is literally a code. It's these symbols that by themselves have no meaning. There's no inherent meaning. So even at that level, we have to bring our knowledge of the sound system, the phonemic system, to even say the sounds, let alone to make sense of the words. So reading is as much bringing our knowledge to the text as it is taking information from the text. And in places like the university, where what you're reading is a lot of new and unfamiliar information, that's the point. That's why it's assigned. If you knew it already, in principle, you wouldn't take the class. That is not what we're doing when we're reading on our phones, or even the New York Times or the newspaper or a novel. It doesn't have this purpose. We know a lot more of the words and the concepts and the context of those things. So, but in academic context, we're trying to make sense of this stuff. So we have to bring what we know, and these authors presume specific knowledge. And if you don't have it, it's going to be really hard to make sense of that. It doesn't matter what you're trying to extract. You have to make tons of inferences, contextualize this information, make linkages back to previous chapters, follow extensive chains of reasoning, all of which require not only bringing prior knowledge and specific domain knowledge, but knowledge of how textbooks work, knowledge of skills and strategies, the knowledge of the features of the text and how to use them to support your comprehension. So you talked about reading from the first word and going through. Well, the texts aren't organized that way. They have chapters and headings and examples and figures, and there's even an index in the back, and there's a table of context. It's all these features are designed to help us read non-linearly. That's what they are. That's why they're there. That's why the back there is an index, all these page numbers, so you can read non-linearly. That's why there's a thing at the bottom, at the end, that says conclusion, so you can find it and then read that in a different order. And those are all because these texts are highly demanding in terms of knowledge and what we bring to the text. But notice, and here's the point I really want to make here about these features, they only work if you know what the features are and what they do. That's in your head. The chapter doesn't begin by saying, there's a conclusion at the end, and here's what it does. Right? We don't do that. We don't say, here's what figures do. It's not in the text. It's in your head. And so that's your knowledge that you bring to the text.
So I'm curious, and I know we want to look at other misconceptions and myths, but how did this point go over in the reading course you just taught, and like were students overwhelmed? Did they feel like, oh my gosh, like, okay, that really helps me? Or was it like, because I could see what you just said,
Yeah.
they could like, well, I don't have the context, so why should I even bother
Mhm.
reading this? That could be a one reaction.
That's a good point. So yeah, there's contextual knowledge, there's specific domain knowledge, there's knowledge of strategies. So I think one way that it's beneficial and not overwhelming is it gives an explanation that's actually addressable, which is knowledge. Knowledge is something I can collect and build and develop. Um, so that's now it's within my scope. It's within, I can feel efficacious about that. Oh, I can do something about that. We can also pinpoint the kinds of knowledges. We can also even, this analysis also shows we expect you not to know everything because so much is new and unfamiliar. And in fact, these texts will be frustrating. You don't have enough knowledge to just zoom through like you would some memes on your phone. Reading is not reading. And this is one of the ways it's not just a unitary process that affects how you do it and your experience of it. Some other ways then too, it suggests specific strategies to make sense comprehensible to oneself rather than become a better reader today, tonight, when I'm trying to read this assignment. Like, well, that's not going to happen. No, the method is gain in a systematic, pointed way, relevant, salient, prior knowledge. What's this chapter about? What I've heard students now use AI to ask an article, what prior knowledge does this article presume? What a great prompt. What a great way to use that.
Yeah.
And then AI is particularly well designed for that because it's going to deliver it to you at a low level. Because that's all it can do. That's not sufficient to read at a Princeton level anyways, that article, but it can make the article accessible. It'll help you provide the knowledge that you need to make the inferences. Right now you can bring that knowledge, or you can prime you, or it can activate knowledge that you kind of knew, has all these benefits. But if it's inert, even if you know something, but you don't see the relevance, then we would say it's inert. You're not using it to make sense of the text. So effectively you might as well not have it. So that suggests strategies. And then of course, the third kind of knowledge that I was talking about is knowledge of text features and then strategies to make the most of them, which is exactly what the course is about.
And by that, do you mean the kind of nonlinear approach to reading, or
that would be
else?
one? Yeah.
Okay.
Like what are the functions of different portions of the text, even to know, for instance, particularly around long, what we sometimes call extended discourse, like a nonfiction book, a few hundred pages, complex discourse. There are actually patterns that writers use. So they tend to use common we call them micro structures in chapters. What's the claim? What's the evidence? What's the explanation? What's the counterpoint? What's the the rebuttal to that point? What's the implication for the larger argument that was stated as a thesis at the beginning of the chapter? Or observation, there's all these little mini observation structures. And if you tune to those, if you notice, hey, I should look for those. Then when I do, I find them. And then when I find them, I can use them. So that would be another way that we could use knowledge of text features to improve our reading and learning from text.
And this might be taking us kind of off topic a little bit, but I'm kind of reflecting back on my time at the university, and I found students when I asked them if they read the article or whatever, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I read it." But this meant that they did take kind of a fiction book approach to it. Like, okay, I started on the first word of the first page and read it to the end, so I read it.
Mm-hmm.
Versus comprehending or really doing an analysis of the text, which then leads to a bit of the nonlinear approach. And I found a lot of resistance to that. Like I would tell students, like if we're reading a book, and I could be off, but this is just my own approach. It's like, well, let's, really take time to read the introductory chapter, maybe read that 2-3 times. And then you can even go to the epilogue or the last chapter, because that's where they're probably summing everything up. That was, I said, well, go there. And then that kind of bookends and gives you kind of what's going to happen in between. And then as you're reading in between, if the guy gives, or the author, sorry, gives 4 or 5 examples, well, if you kind of got the gist on the first and second, maybe you don't need to read the third, fourth, and fifth. You can move on. And they'd be like, I can't do that. That's somehow sacrilegious,
Yeah. Good students don't do that.
Right.
Also, so there's a few ways we might come at that. Well, one thing I would just want to point out, I never read a nonfiction book other than a textbook in all of my K-12 schooling. I read them for pleasure outside of school, and I read novels, but I'm not even sure I would have known what to call a nonfiction book. And many students at Princeton call them novels, which is a sign. And then it doesn't surprise me that then they read them like novels. So the structure you're talking about, these features are features of nonfiction books, not novels. Right? So there's a particular structure of these books that you've learned through many examples of reading them and writing yourself that allow you to know these common patterns and then use those patterns strategically and purposefully. It's not obvious that you would read the beginning 3 times and read the core later halfway. That is not at all intuitive, right? And it also is related to what you're going to do with it, by the way, but we'll leave that aside for now. Then secondly, our reading practices are socialized, right? So this is another issue with reading. It's invisible. I don't believe we're really taught how to read. We're taught enough to teach ourselves how to read. That's my experience. There's a few schools, like in secondary schools, that really do teach students how to do this. Most students dismiss it and are deeply bored by it, but don't recognize the power of it, I think. But the point is that students have been conditioned and socialized. And I just had a conversation with a student last week about this, about why are you trying to read these hundreds and hundreds of pages that you're assigned in this way? And we unpacked it, and they said, well, yeah, in high school, I'm assigned a chapter, I read it, kind of anything in that chapter is fair game for a quiz. The quiz will be at a surface level about a key term or some big idea. And so I need to know all of them to be able to respond to this picayune little question. And so that's how I read. And then I said, okay, does Princeton ever test you that way? No. What do they care about? And they could say, but they hadn't adjusted their strategies yet. I need to know the main argument. I need to understand the claims and evidence and the reasoning and then be able to critique it, evaluate it. And I need to connect that text with the other ones assigned that week to the lecture and the preceding 4 weeks of content in relation to the themes and framework of the class. The things I just mentioned are far beyond comprehension. They presume mostly comprehension, but what the high school kind of conventional reading would be something more like comprehension. What do we mean by that? I would say something like comprehensive understanding. Whereas at Princeton or other scholarly places, you don't actually have to have a comprehensive understanding, but you can have less than comprehension in a way, but you definitely need to have more than comprehension. Because we're going to ask you to critique it, break it apart, do a close analysis, put it in context. There's all these other synthesize. And those are much higher order processes. And they specifically have corresponding internal mental processes to create that understanding.
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, I just want to really appreciate what you're saying and acknowledge that, because just the contextual and social dimensions, because you're right, because like high school students have adapted to a way of reading because that's what, based on the expectations that they have from the teacher, that they need to know every little date and whatever. But then they go to college, like you said, and they've had at least 4 years, if not more, of that type of training. So of course they're going to apply that to the way they read in college. And yet then they get hit by these other expectations. They're unaware of initially, and they're not prepared because no one has said, hey, wait a minute, it's the way you read is going to need to change when you get into college. And same thing when you transition out of college. You maybe have adapted over those 4 years in college and got to a point by the time you're a senior that you've kind of got it, and then you go into the work force or even graduate studies, and they could be completely different.
That's right.
And no one's kind of sits you down and says, hey, wait a minute, you're going to need to realize that reading isn't reading, as you said. There's these learning from text, and that all these and they change in terms of what you need to do and your expectations around that. So anyway, that's really
well, you made great points. The context matters. I think that's, again, going back to the Goethe quote, I think that's what he's getting at. I'll say lastly, it's not even that they were trained to read, it's they were conditioned. It's a little different.
Right.
And it makes it harder to unpack. But I would want to, so that's one big idea, is like, we're not aware. Reading is so automatic, and we've been doing it so long, and we weren't taught, we were conditioned. So it's hard to unlearn and change. And I said another thing, that sometimes when people do talk about the variety and escalating difficulty and differences between high school, undergrad, grad, professional career, they have a very superficial understanding of that. Like, I just need to do this differently. And I don't think that's helpful. I think we need to understand that these are fundamentally different internal cognitive processes that we are not used to employing in this context. And I've experienced that. I remember going to grad school in an early seminar, and this is one more point. And it was a very small seminar. I think there were 2 students, one very renowned professor, and I was a little intimidated, I will admit. I think I was a second or third year student, but the other student, this woman, was a first year. Significantly, she had come from Harvard. So not only was she smarter than me, she was better prepared than me. But one of the things I was noticing as we were having these conversations is the professor would really pick up the things that she said and not so much what I said. And I'm like, what's going on here? Why is this? And then I realized I was talking about a text individually. So I was trained to do that from a very early age. Here's this text, talk about it for a few weeks, put it aside, of Mice and Men, and then read the next thing, and then and it was a serial reading of individual texts. That's not scholarly writing. Scholarly reading and writing is highly intertextual, highly multitextual. Texts are always in dialogue with one another, arguing, counter-arguing, extending. So you want to think of it as a river of discourse, and the text has a particular function, and to understand it, you need to put it in this tradition. That's what scholars value. I wasn't doing that, and she was. And it took me a while to figure that out.
Right.
Yeah. Then I had to figure out how to do it. By then the seminar was over, I think, but that's okay. I learned something about reading. And so I think maybe we can, one bit of advice too is, because ultimately I'm practical, anybody listening who's struggling with these ways of reading, is to kind of look and say, what are the readings, the ways of reading that are being affirmed, validated, that seem to have traction in the context you're in? What are their features? How did people arrive at that? And then try to kind of reverse engineering what went on in their heads a little bit, or you can ask them too. And the most common one at Princeton would be, I'm used to reading to have a summary of the text. I come to class, I share my summary, and the professor or the teacher helps to extend that. And I would say, no, you do your reading, you make a critique, you come to class prepared to share your critique and put it in dialogue with your classmates and your professor, or your analysis. And that's a very different task.
Well, let me just pause there for someone who says, well, what do you mean by a critique? What would that consist of? What would you say to that?
It can mean different things in different fields, but a crucial word of critique is evaluative. So we're evaluating the text. I think traditionally that meant, or most generously means, evaluating the text in the author's own terms, did. So the author, we might say, makes a promise in their thesis, I'm going to do this. They point to methods and this is nonfiction. And then we say, okay, did they achieve what they set out to do? Is it sound? Does the logic hold? Are the claims they're making justified? So within their terms, that's one kind of critique evaluation. Another then would be, okay, but what about in my terms, from my paradigm or my question? And I can evaluate that. So I can say something is logically coherent and consistent, and they've made their case. But I can say, so what? Not important from my vantage point. Here's why. Or I might question some basic assumptions that they're making that could be debatable. They're not necessarily provable. And I say something like, that makes sense, is sound if you make that assumption, but I actually make another one. So I don't believe that X, Y, or Z. I don't accept that. Let me explain that argument. And so those would be a couple different kinds of critique.
Yeah. How would you, so that's, I mean, that seems to apply to a lot of the classes, like, you know, if you're in a philosophy class or ethics, even history. I don't know if this is a fair question, but it popped in my head, so I'm going to ask it.
Yeah.
How would you differentiate an English class, a high school English class, from a college English class?
Great question. Going back to the conditioning. So I think, so the college literature class, English, is going to reflect the scholarly literary critical traditions and conventions of the time that your instructors, your professors have been trained in. So they have PhDs in literary criticism, not teaching English, not teaching, and they're sitting in their professor chair, certainly at Princeton or other places, because they have a very distinct theoretical lens. They've brought something to the discussion of literature that very few other people have. So it makes sense that they're going to read literature in a pretty different way than you would. That's why they're there. And there's a few other basic frameworks that literary critics use that high school teachers do not. So the default in high school and before is something like, your job is to find out what the author intended, trace that, how they achieve that intention, and be able to explain that. And then get it right. And that your teacher knows what that intention was and whether your explanation or interpretation is sufficient or not. These premises are not held by most literary critics. The idea that what we're trying to do and read literature is find out what what the writer wanted is false. They just do not accept that premise. They're saying, so that's an old-fashioned way of reading that is not very popular in contemporary literary criticism in the field. And then the professors are bringing these scholarly ways of reading, assumptions, values, beliefs to the classroom. I think this is captured, for instance, in the phrase, if you've ever heard it, the author is dead. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So there's a phrase, the author is dead. And I think what it's trying to, I'm not a literary critic, but I think what it's trying to capture is we're not so concerned with what the author intended. We're concerned with what the text means to me in this current context. At least that's at least as valid. In part because authors, like anybody else, are expressing their times.
Right.
They're writing, there's things that are coming out that they're not intentionally communicating. That's one angle. Another angle, I've heard literary criticism in contemporary late 20th and early 21st century terms as kind of the sociology of literature, if that makes sense. So bringing these categories from socio-political frameworks and applying them to literature. And some philosophy, that's probably definitely as well. And so that's a pretty different kind of reading than most of us are taught, which we might call a literary reading. So that would be symbolism, plot structure, character development, the arc of the character of the story. So this is really looking at story or narrative as qua narrative, and then identifying key symbolic passages or what are the symbolisms and how do they use figurative language and things of that nature. And that's what the authors were playing with at the time. So you're trying to understand that. So I remember reading like Moby Dick and some of these Melville and these giant sentences, and there's a kind of rhythm to it. And it took me a long time to figure it out. I'm like, well, what are they doing with the language that feels so different than, one of my favorites, Steinbeck or Hemingway? They're doing very different things stylistically. But that is a way of reading. So anyways, I got off track there. The main point is that the scholarly lenses of literary critics, which is who your professors are very different than the conventional reader of fiction, including your high school English teacher.
Well, I'm always shocked when I look up at the clock and realize, oh my gosh, we're trying to keep these to a half an hour so they're digestible. But before we go, and again, we're going to come back to this topic. But again, I feel like if I was a high school student transitioning to college, or a recent college going to the workforce, and again, you're in this new context, you come with presuppositions on how you're supposed to do things, and that is part of what leads to the anxiety and frustration.
Mm-hmm.
And most students do adapt, but what are kind of the one or two or three strategies or whatever to help students to adapt more quickly than they might otherwise?
Well, in the world today, you can find most of what I just said on the internet. You can ask it. So that's one place, and it's not going to be sufficient. Knowing about reading is not the same as doing, but it'll get you started. Number two is maybe asking your professor different sorts of questions. So this kind of reading is probably a kind of apprenticeship. It's an internal process. It's hard to know what's going on. The professor has a bunch of ways of thinking. It's probably better done like an apprentice in office hours, talking to them. How do you approach the readings? How did you learn to do that? That's one. So that's another one. I think also, and you can talk with friends about that too. And collectively, you can read better than you can individually. But another one, I'd say, this is maybe the most basic, because maybe you're in a big old class and there's 300 people and you're sitting up, and this would be my case, in college, is when you can, and pay attention to what the professor is doing when they do an analysis of a passage of text or a text, not just what they're saying. So we tend to write down what the interpretation of that passage was and its significance. That's useful. But there's one thing we know, as if you're thinking practically, you cannot write about that example on your paper. That's sort of the rules of the game, because they did the analysis. So what are we supposed to learn from an analysis of a passage that we actually can't write about, according to the rules of the game? We're supposed to learn how to do it. Some professors are good at signaling. Well, then I asked myself this question. Then I brought this theme to bear. And then I thought about this concept. And last week, remember where we read this? I had that in mind. And in fact, that's why I assigned this text. All those mental processes may be signaled, but they're usually not. So as a student in a class observing an expert do an explication or an analysis of text, you want to be saying, how'd they do that? How'd they do that? Notice it's a direct parallel within your math class when your professor's solving a problem. What you see on the board or wherever is the expression of their thinking. It's the next step, but not how they made it. It's very similar. You actually want to get inside their head. What are the cognitive processes they're engaging in? And then can I emulate that? So I think that's probably the most, I think it's fairly concrete, but it's not an easy strategy to implement. There's others, but I think those three.
No, and who am I to add to that list? But
please do.
I think even before those, the key strategy for me would be to realize that it is going to be different. That's not really a strategy, but that's part of what we did when we give those. Nick and I used to give talks at in high schools, and we kind of the title or theme was "College is not grade 13," and that was a lot of what we did was just to try to sensitize students to the fact that things are going to be very different, radically different, and you need to be ready for that, so that you're not blindsided by all these changes and different expectations. So just knowing that, the way you need to read, or what's going to be expected of you, but not necessarily explicitly said. That's right. What's tough, because I love what you used to say, and I've said this repeatedly to other people, is if in high school, if everyone got 50% on a test, whose fault is it? It's really the blame was put on the teacher, most likely. Whereas if that happened in college, blame was put on the students. And that could happen within months. I think the way you put it, you went from a academic adolescence to an academic adult within 3-4 months, and no one told you that that's what happened. And so you come with ways you've adapted, you kind of with the momentum from high school, and then that proves often quite insufficient for you to succeed and thrive in college. So just knowing that it's going to be different, I think, is a huge first step. And then once you know that, then you're probably more inclined, or better, or at least you might start asking the questions right. that you're talking about, because you're sensitized to say, okay, this is going to be different, and I don't really know how it's going to be different. So I need to be asking questions. I need to be aware of certain ways and pick up clues that I wouldn't have known that I need to be aware of, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're sensitized, you're primed.
Yeah.
You're for the variety and complexity. Yeah.
Right. Well, again, we'll come back to this, and of all the courses that we're working on, one is the transition to college, and which we'll probably pick up this theme as well. So that's coming down the pike. So thanks, Nick. Really great talk. I think next week we're going to be talking about a book called Make It Stick.
Make It Stick, yes.
Which is different. There's another book called Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath that was very popular. But this is a different book called Make It Stick, which is on learning theory, or anyway, it was written in the early 2010s, right? Somewhere in there.
Yeah, 2013 or 14. Really popular
14.
Book in some circles of education, higher education. So I think there's some useful translation of some research, and I have a critique, to come back to that word, from my theoretical vantage point. So but anyways, thanks a lot, Matt, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my passion and my roots in reading. Appreciate it.
That's great. And like I said, we'll come back to this topic in the future. So, all right, take care.
You too.